Hello everyone, welcome to Sleepy Crimes Hub. I'm here with you tonight to help you relax and slowly fall asleep. I know many of you are watching this video to rest your mind. So before we begin, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Now get comfortable, close your eyes if you like, take a deep breath, and let go of the day. Let's gently begin with case 1. Tammy Jo Alexander was born in Atlanta, Georgia, on November 2nd, 1963, but her early life was far from stable or secure. Although she later attended high school in Brooksville, Florida, her childhood was shaped by constant emotional turbulence inside her own home. According to her half-sister, Pamela Dyson, Tammy grew up in an environment that felt unpredictable and suffocating, one that likely pushed her to dream of escape from a very young age. Dyson, who had a different father, was sent to live with her paternal grandmother when Tammy was around 11 years old, which meant the two sisters did not grow up side by side for long. Tammy, meanwhile, remained in the household with her mother, Barbara Jenkins, and a stepfather, without the presence or support of her biological father, who played no role in her life at all. Pamela later described their mother as deeply troubled, struggling with an addiction to prescription medication and suffering from severe emotional instability. Jenkins was prone to sudden temper tantrums, mood swings, and episodes that left the household tense and frightening, especially for a young girl trying to understand her place in the world. Dyson recalled that her mother was suicidal and believed that, even back then, she was dealing with serious mental health issues that were never properly diagnosed or treated. Growing up surrounded by addiction, emotional volatility, and the absence of a protective parental figure, Tammy's childhood was marked by chaos rather than comfort, planting the seeds for a restlessness that may explain why she eventually felt the need to run toward an unknown future rather than remain trapped in a home that offered her little sense of safety or belonging. Jenkins worked long hours as a waitress at a truck stop, a place where the days blurred into nights and strangers passed through without ever staying long. When Tammy reached her teenage years, she began working there alongside her mother, spending her days in an environment filled with constant movement and temporary connections. During this period, Tammy developed a pattern of running away, disappearing for days or weeks at a time, driven by a restless desire to leave her life behind. One of her close friends, Laurel Noel, later recalled that the two girls would sometimes hitchhike with truck drivers, trusting complete strangers to carry them far from home. On one occasion, their journey took them all the way across the country to California, a reckless adventure that felt like freedom at the time. But the escape did not last. Once they arrived, reality set in, and Noel eventually contacted her parents, who paid for airline tickets to bring both girls back to Florida, pulling Tammy back into the life she had tried so hard to outrun. Years later, on January 17th, 1998, Barbara Jenkins died at the age of 56, and in a cruel twist of fate, her obituary listed Tammy as deceased as well, reflecting the family's long-held belief that she was already gone. Until Tammy was finally identified years later, Pamela Dyson had continued to assume that her half-sister had simply built a new life somewhere far away from the shadow of their troubled home. She imagined Tammy in a place of peace, with a loving husband, children, and the stability she never had growing up, believing that all Tammy had ever wanted was to leave everything behind and start over completely. On the morning of November 10th, 1979, a quiet rural area in Caledonia, New York, was suddenly transformed into the scene of a mystery when a local farmer made a grim discovery in one of his cornfields near the Genesee River, about 23 miles southwest of Rochester. From a distance, the farmer noticed a flash of red clothing among the rows of corn and assumed it belonged to a trespassing hunter, something not entirely unheard of in the area. Curious and slightly annoyed, he went closer to investigate, only to realize that what he had seen was far more disturbing. Lying there was the body of a teenage girl. Shocked by what he had found, the farmer immediately contacted the police, setting off an investigation that would haunt the region for decades. When investigators arrived, they found that the young girl was fully clothed and showed no signs of sexual assault. ruling out some initial theories almost immediately. A closer examination revealed that she had died from severe hemorrhaging caused by 2 gunshot wounds, one fired directly in her head above the right eye and another into her back. The head wound suggested that she had been taken completely by surprise, showing no indication that she had turned or flinched before the shot was fired, a detail that deeply unsettled investigators. Her pockets were turned inside out, a clear sign that any form of identification she may have been carrying had been deliberately removed, making it nearly impossible to know who she was or where she had come from. With no name, no documents, and no one coming forward to claim her, investigators gave her a temporary identity, referring to her as Caledonia Jane Doe, later shortened to Callie Doe, as the search for her true identity and the person responsible for her death quietly began. The autopsy conducted by the medical examiner helped piece together the final moments of Tammy Jo Alexander's life and revealed a chilling sequence of events. Evidence showed that she had first been shot in the head while standing beside the road that bordered the cornfield, near a bloodstain found on the ground that marked the initial point of the attack. The placement of the wound suggested she was caught completely off guard, with no chance to react or defend herself. After that first shot, her body was dragged away from the roadside and pulled deeper into the cornfield, an act that pointed to deliberate effort rather than panic. There, she was shot a second time in the back and then abandoned among the tall rows of corn, left where the killer believed she would not be easily seen. Compounding the cruelty of the crime, heavy rain fell throughout the night of her death, washing away much of the physical and forensic evidence that could have identified the person responsible. Any possible DNA traces, footprints, or marks left on her clothing and body were largely erased by the storm, leaving investigators with little more than fragments of a story and turning the case into a haunting mystery that would resist answers for decades. During the 1980s, one of the earliest officers to respond to the scene in 1979, Livingston County Deputy Sheriff John York, rose through the ranks and was eventually elected sheriff. From the moment he took office, he made a deliberate decision to keep the case of Caledonia Jane Doe alive, refusing to allow it to fade into obscurity as so many cold cases do. York served as sheriff until 2013, and throughout those decades, the investigation remained officially open, with the unidentified girl never forgotten by those who had seen her that morning in the cornfield. Before her identity was known, investigators could only estimate her age, believing she was somewhere between 13 and 19 years old, which placed her birth roughly between 1958 and 1967. They estimated her height at about 5 feet 3 inches and her weight at around 120 pounds, trying to give the public a picture of who she might have been. She was described as having brown eyes and wavy, light brown hair that reached her shoulders, with the front portion noticeably lighter in color, suggesting it had been bleached or sunlightened about 4 months before her death and was beginning to grow out. Small details stood out, including her toenails, which were painted a coral color, a quiet reminder that she had once taken time to care about her appearance. Other physical clues hinted at the life she may have lived before arriving in New York. Investigators noted clear tan lines from a halter top or bikini, an observation that raised important questions. In the late 1970s, tanning beds were rare, and upstate New York in October and November did not offer enough sun to create such markings, suggesting she likely came from a warmer, sunnier region. Freckles were visible across the back of her shoulders, and acne was present on her face and chest, details consistent with a young teenager still in the midst of adolescence. Her dental condition told another quiet but troubling story. Her teeth were completely natural, with no fillings or restorations, indicating she had likely never received professional dental care. Several of her permanent molars showed severe decay, while her wisdom teeth had not yet erupted, further reinforcing the belief that she was very young at the time of her death. Investigators also determined that her blood type was A negative, carefully documenting every small detail in the hope that one day, somewhere, someone would recognize these fragments of a life and finally put a name to the girl known only as Caledonia Jane Doe. Several hours before her death, Tammy Jo Alexander had shared what would unknowingly become her final meal. The autopsy revealed that she had eaten sweet corn, potatoes, and boiled canned ham, a simple, ordinary combination that made her last hours feel heartbreakingly human. Investigators believe the meal may have come from a diner in nearby Lima, New York, where a waitress later recalled seeing a young girl matching Tammy's description sitting and eating with an adult man. That small but unsettling detail raised troubling questions about who the man was and what role he may have played in the events that followed, though his identity was never confirmed at the time. It was one of the few moments placing Tammy alive and in public shortly before she was killed, offering a brief glimpse into the final stretch of her journey. Years later, as forensic science advanced, investigators returned to Tammy's remains searching for answers that technology in 1979 could not provide. When her body was exhumed, several of her teeth were sent for mineralogical and forensic isotope analysis, a process that examines how the minerals in teeth reflect the composition of the drinking water a person consumed while growing up. Because water chemistry varies by region, these isotopic signatures can help narrow down where someone spent their childhood. Early testing focused on the oxygen isotope ratio in her dental enamel, and the results were revealing. They suggested that Tammy had likely spent her early years in the southern or southwestern United States, a finding that quietly echoed earlier clues like her tan lines and further supported the idea that she had traveled far from home before her life was violently cut short in a cold New York cornfield. In 2006, decades after Tammy Jo Alexander's death, forensic investigators turned to a branch of science that had not existed when she was killed: palynology, the study of pollen. Paul Chambers, a newly hired investigator at the Monroe County Medical Examiner's Office, requested permission to send Tammy's clothing to the palynology laboratory at Texas A&M University, hoping that the tiniest botanical traces might reveal where she had lived or traveled before her death. The results proved startling. The researchers discovered pollen grains from several types of plants, including casuarina, commonly known as Australian pine or she oak, Quercus, Picea, spruce, and Betula. These grains were carefully compared to a control sample collected from the rural New York site, where Tammy's body had been found in 1979, a method designed to determine whether the pollen had originated at the dump site or elsewhere. The analysis revealed a striking anomaly. Although oak, spruce, and birch grow in many parts of the United States, none of these species were found near the site where Tammy's body had been discovered. Spruce and birch pollen, in particular, were only consistent with species that grow in mountainous regions of California. Even more intriguing were the casuarina pollen grains, which come from an invasive tree that survives in only a few regions of North America, including southern Florida, southern Texas, parts of Mexico, and select areas of California, such as the North Bay near San Francisco, San Luis Obispo, and San Diego. The temperate climate of upstate New York could not support such trees, meaning the pollen had clung to Tammy's clothing long before she ever arrived in the state. Taken together with other physical clues, such as Tammy's visible tan lines, forensic researchers were able to create a rough map of her likely travels before her death. They proposed that she may have been living in the southwestern United States, near the San Diego region, before traveling, possibly by hitchhiking, through mountainous areas of the Sierra Nevada, where spruce and birch trees grow, passing through cities like Reno, Nevada, and eventually making her way across the country to New York. A re-examination of the pollen grains in 2012 reinforced these findings, confirming that the only realistic origins for the samples were California, Arizona, or Florida. This tiny, almost invisible trail of pollen not only suggested where Tammy had been, but also hinted at the long and dangerous journey she may have undertaken in the months or years leading up to the tragic day her life ended. After more than 35 years of uncertainty, Tammy Jo Alexander was finally identified on January 26, 2015, bringing a measure of closure to a decades-old mystery. The breakthrough came thanks to the persistence of Laurel Noel, a close friend from Tammy's high school years in Florida, who had begun searching for her in the early 2010s using social media. Through her efforts, Noel eventually connected with Tammy's half-sister, Pamela Dyson, who lived in Panama City. Dyson had known that Tammy often ran away from home as a teenager, But the two sisters had not lived together after Pamela was sent to live with their grandmother around age 11. When Dyson learned of Noel's search, she realized that no one in the family had known anything about Tammy's whereabouts since she left sometime between 1977 and 1979. An ex-boyfriend confirmed that the last time he had seen her was in the spring of 1979, offering one of the final verifiable glimpses of her life before tragedy struck. As they pieced together the story, both Dyson and Noel grew increasingly concerned that Tammy had fallen victim to foul play. Dyson recalled that her mother had reported Tammy missing at the time, but because Tammy had a well-documented history of running away and eventually returning, the family feared that law enforcement may not have taken the case seriously. Their worst fears were partially confirmed decades later. In August 2014, the Hernando County Sheriff's Office informed them that no official missing persons report had ever been filed for Tammy. Once this oversight came to light, authorities immediately opened a formal case, reigniting the search for answers and setting in motion the investigation that would ultimately confirm Tammy's identity. For decades, she had existed in the public record only as Caledonia Jane Doe, a mysterious figure whose story hung in suspense, until the determined efforts of those who loved her finally gave her name back. Tammy Jo Alexander's long and heartbreaking story came together through a combination of persistence, modern technology, and the dedication of strangers who refused to let her remain forgotten. Carl Koppelman, a California artist and moderator of the Web Sleuths online community, first encountered her case while reviewing a missing person report. Koppelman had a unique connection to the investigation. In 2010, 4 years earlier, he had created a forensic sketch of an unidentified victim known as Caledonia Jane Doe and shared it on the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, hoping someone might recognize her. In September 2014, when he came across a new missing person listing for Tammy Jo Alexander, he was immediately struck by the strong resemblance to the sketch he had made years before. Realizing this could be an important lead, he contacted the Livingston County Sheriff's Office and shared the information with the NAMUS Regional Administrator, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and the Hernando County Sheriff's Office. His tip led investigators to request a DNA sample from Tammy's half-sister, Pamela Dyson. In January 2015, the Monroe County Medical Examiner confirmed the truth many had hoped for. Mitochondrial DNA from the unidentified remains matched Pamela Dyson, proving that Caledonia Jane Doe was Tammy Jo Alexander. On January 26, 2015, Sheriff Thomas Doherty announced the identification during a press conference, finally bringing closure to a mystery that had lasted more than 35 years. Although the truth was painful, Tammy's family chose to keep her buried in Dansville, New York, and planned a service to honor her memory. Reflecting on the discovery, Pamela Dyson described the moment as bittersweet, saying she was grateful for the closure, even though it was heartbreaking to learn how Tammy had died. It's terrible. Nobody should have to be shot and dragged out into the woods. In a small but meaningful gesture, the Doherty Funeral Home in Livonia removed the generic Jane Doe headstone and replaced it with one engraved with Tammy's name and lifespan. On June 10th, 2015, a public ceremony unveiled the new headstone, attended by roughly 100 family members and community supporters who offered their condolences and shared in the acknowledgement of her identity. Dyson publicly thanked the police and the Livingston community for their tireless work and urged other families of missing persons to register them with NAMUS, emphasizing the pivotal role the database had played in bringing her sister's story to a close. Even as decades had passed, Tammy's voice found a way to reach the world. On November 2nd, 2020, what would have been her 57th birthday, the Livingston County Sheriff's Office released 3 audio clips of Alexander speaking, recordings she had made in July 1979 on a cassette tape and sent to her boyfriend, who had kept them safe until handing them over to investigators. These recordings offered a haunting reminder of a life that had been lost, a young woman's voice echoing across the years, bringing an emotional and human dimension to a story that had, for too long, existed only as a cold case. They serve not only as a tribute to Tammy's memory, but also as a testament to the determination of those who refused to let her remain unknown, ensuring that after decades of silence, the world finally knew her name. With Tammy Jo Alexander finally identified, the focus of the investigation shifted from wondering who she was to the urgent question of who had taken her life. Sheriff Thomas Doherty emphasized to the media that knowing the victim was one of the most crucial steps in solving the case, explaining, "This case is burning hot. We're going to be working it harder than ever." Even decades after the crime, authorities remained determined to pursue every possible lead. Former Sheriff John York later reflected that more than 10,000 leads had already been investigated, demonstrating the relentless, painstaking effort law enforcement had invested in trying to uncover the truth. Witnesses placed Alexander with a white male who stood between 5 feet 8 and 5 feet 9 inches tall. He was seen driving a tan station wagon and wore distinctive black wire-rimmed glasses. And while police have labeled him a person of interest, his identity remains unknown. A waitress at the diner, where Alexander and the man ate on the evening of her death, recalled that he had paid for their meal, a seemingly small but telling detail that tied the man directly to Tammy's last known movements. These fragments of memory, carried quietly by strangers for decades, may hold the key to solving a case that has left so many questions unanswered. Over the years, the investigation also contended with false leads and confessions that ultimately proved unhelpful. In 1984, serial killer Henry Lee Lucas confessed to killing an unidentified girl, though he did not provide details that could connect him to Alexander, and investigators found no evidence to substantiate his claim. At one point, attention turned to Christopher Wilder, a known serial killer active in the 1980s, whose interest in vehicle racing coincided with Tammy's jacket, which bore a brand linked to Wilder's purchases. Unfortunately, Wilder was killed in a police shootout in 1984 before investigators could interview him about the Alexander case, leaving yet another tantalizing theory unresolved. Even as decades have passed, the search for a killer continues, with authorities determined to follow every lead and uncover the truth behind the tragic death of a young woman whose life and story had been silenced for far too long. Investigators have long speculated that the murder weapon used to kill Tammy Jo Alexander was a .38 caliber handgun. A spent slug was recovered from the dirt beneath her body, and forensic experts compared it to hundreds of bullets from confiscated weapons across the United States. Despite exhaustive efforts to trace firearms from the US, Canada, Europe, and Mexico, the slug could not be linked to any specific gun, leaving authorities without a clear lead on the weapon or the person who had fired it. The mystery of the gun and its owner became one of the many frustrating gaps in a case that had already defied resolution for decades. In an effort to generate new leads, the FBI took the unusual step of posting billboards across the country, sharing Tammy's story with the public, and asking anyone with information to come forward. By the end of February 2015, the Livingston County Sheriff's Department reported that they had received a significant increase in tips since Tammy's identification. Some of these tips allowed investigators to begin piecing together a plausible scenario of the events that may have brought her to Caledonia, New York. One particularly notable lead came from a trucker in Tennessee, who contacted authorities after hearing a radio broadcast about the case. Police described his information as significant, though details were not publicly released. Further inquiries revealed that Tammy had connections to a former prison ministry in Young Harris, Georgia, an organization that worked with individuals on probation or parole. This connection provided insight into the people she may have encountered and the environments she moved through in her final months. By early 2016, investigators had identified 3 male persons of interest who had known Tammy and collected DNA sample from the clothing she had been wearing when she died. However, by November of that year, the FBI reported that none of the 3 men matched the DNA found on her clothing, underscoring how elusive the killer remained. By 2020, the male DNA discovered was being tested against national databases to search for familial connections, a modern forensic technique that offers hope that, even decades later, the person responsible for Tammy's murder could be identified. Each new lead, no matter how small, renewed the possibility of justice in a case that had haunted the community for more than 40 years. For decades, Tammy Jo Alexander's story captured the attention of the nation, even while she remained unidentified. Her case was featured on high-profile programs such as America's Most Wanted, bringing her tragic story into countless homes and keeping hope alive that someone, somewhere, might recognize her or come forward with information. The mystery of Caledonia Jane Doe became a symbol of the many cold cases that linger unresolved, capturing the public imagination as a haunting story of a young life stolen too soon. Even years after her identification, media attention continued to shine a light on Tammy's life and the investigation into her murder. In August 2024, the true crime podcast Method and Madness dedicated an episode to her case, working closely with the Livingston County Sheriff's Department to ensure accuracy and context. This effort reflected the enduring public fascination with her story and the desire to keep the investigation alive in the public consciousness. Following her identification, two news organizations based in Rochester, New York, collaborated in May 2016 to produce a multi-part podcast titled Finding Tammy Jo. Hosted by reporters Veronica Volk from WXXI News and Gary Craig from the Democrat and Chronicle, the series delved deeply into Tammy's life, her final days, and the painstaking decades-long investigation that had finally restored her name. Over the course of a year, Volk and Craig conducted extensive interviews with potential witnesses, law enforcement officials, and Tammy's family and friends, piecing together both the human and investigative elements of a story that had remained unsolved for so long. Through these broadcasts and podcasts, the world was given not just the details of a cold case, but a portrait of a young woman whose life had meaning, whose story demanded to be remembered, and whose pursuit of justice continued to inspire those determined to see her killer held accountable. Case 2 on June 1st, 1982, 14-year-old Michelle Garvey disappeared from her home in New London, Connecticut, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and deep concern for her family. At the time, it was presumed that she had run away, a possibility that seemed consistent with her past behavior. As the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children later confirmed, she had a history of leaving home without notice. Michelle's family and authorities believe she may have been trying to return to her birth state of New Jersey, or perhaps to North Carolina, seeking the familiarity or freedom she longed for. In those early days, her disappearance carried a lingering uncertainty. It was unclear whether she had fallen victim to foul play or simply attempted to start a new life far from home. For weeks, and eventually months, her whereabouts remained a mystery, leaving loved ones in a limbo of hope and fear, never knowing if she was still alive or if something far more sinister had occurred. Just 1 month after her disappearance, on July 1st, 1982, Michelle Garvey's life was tragically cut short when her body was discovered in a field in Baytown, Texas, hundreds of miles from her home in Connecticut. At the time, authorities were unable to identify her, but a careful examination revealed that the victim was a white female, likely between 15 and 20 years old, with striking blue eyes and curly red hair. The cause of death was determined to be strangulation, a violent end that left investigators searching for answers in a case that had already traveled far beyond her hometown. Even in death, Michelle's physical details offered a small window into her identity. She had an inverted left nipple, one pierced ear, a noticeable scar on one foot, and her blood type was O positive. Her height was estimated to be between 5 feet 1 inch and 5 feet 3 inches, and she was found wearing brown clothing, a long-sleeve, button-down shirt adorned with a distinct horse embroidery on the breast pocket, paired with corduroy pants. The shirt had been unbuttoned, and no bra or shoes were recovered, suggesting sexual assault and pointing to the cruelty she had endured before being left in the field, possibly just hours after her death. With no identification, Michelle was laid to rest as a Jane Doe at the Harris County 2 Cemetery, sharing a burial site with 2 other unidentified victims found the previous year, who would not be identified until 2021 as Dean and Tina Klaus. Even in a temporary grave, her story remained unresolved, a haunting mystery that stretched from the streets of New London to the fields of Baytown. The combination of her youth, distinctive appearance, and the violent circumstances of her death left a lasting impression on investigators and the public alike. emphasizing the urgency to give a name back to a girl who had vanished from her family and the world in the prime of her life. In May 2011, decades after Michelle Garvey's tragic death, her body was exhumed in an effort to finally unlock the secrets that had kept her case cold for so long. Forensic experts sought to obtain a DNA profile that could be compared to potential matches, including samples from her family, hoping that modern technology could provide the breakthrough that had eluded investigators for 30 years. The case took an unexpected turn thanks to the dedication of an amateur online sleuth, Polly Penwell, who had been researching cold cases through the web sleuths community. After carefully comparing Michelle's missing person report with the details of the unidentified body in Texas, Penwell suggested to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC, and the Harris County Medical Examiner that the two cases could be one and the same, offering a critical lead that would reignite the investigation. Following Penwell's tip, authorities acted quickly. In August 2013, the Harris County Police Department contacted Michelle's family to obtain DNA samples, which were then compared with the evidence collected from the remains and with an older DNA sample from her brother that had previously been submitted to the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System and analyzed by the University of North Texas. These efforts culminated in January 2014, when Michelle Garvey was finally identified, ending 31 years of uncertainty and restoring her name after decades of being known only as a Jane Doe. She had vanished from New London, Connecticut, at age 14 and tragically lost her life at 15, far from home and across the country in Texas. With her identity finally confirmed, law enforcement shifted the focus of the investigation from her disappearance to the urgent pursuit of her killer, determined to find justice for Michelle and bring answers to the family who had waited over 3 decades for closure. Investigators later concluded that Michelle Garvey had likely run away from home, slipping out through a window in search of freedom or escape, only to encounter unknown dangers on the road ahead. It is believed that she may have accepted a ride from an unfamiliar driver, a decision that tragically placed her far from home and ultimately led to her untimely death. Authorities have long sought to understand how she ended up in Texas, what the motive for her murder might have been, and who was responsible for transporting her to the field where her life was taken. The circumstances of her death and location even raise questions about possible connections to other unsolved cases in the infamous Texas killing fields, a series of murders that claimed the lives of young women, though no definitive link has ever been established. The gaps in Michelle's final journey remain a haunting mystery, with every detail representing a piece of the puzzle investigators are still trying to solve. After identification, Michelle's remains were returned from Texas to Connecticut, giving her family the long-awaited opportunity to lay her to rest properly. On March 1st, 2014, she was reburied in Montville, Connecticut, in a ceremony that allowed loved ones to honor her memory and finally say goodbye. For decades, she had been known only as a nameless Jane Doe, but at last, Michelle Garvey was restored to her rightful place in the hearts of her family, and her story, though marked by tragedy, was no longer shrouded entirely in uncertainty. Case 3 before this story begins. Pause for a moment and imagine the America of the early 1920s, a time when reputation meant everything, when churches defined social standing, and when scandal could destroy entire families. Now imagine a crime so shocking that it exposed secrets powerful people believed could never be touched. This is not just a double murder. This is a story of forbidden love, public humiliation, family power, and a crime scene staged so deliberately that even after more than a century, the truth still refuses to settle. On September 16, 1922, a quiet field near a farm in Franklin Township, Somerset County, New Jersey, became the center of one of the most infamous true crime mysteries in American history. Early that morning, passers-by noticed something disturbing beneath a crab apple tree in an open field. As they drew closer, they realized they were looking at 2 human bodies lying side by side on their backs. There was no sign of panic in their final positions. Instead, there was an eerie stillness, as if someone had carefully arranged them after death. turning a brutal act into a chilling display. The bodies belonged to Edward Wheeler Hall and Eleanor Reinhardt Mills. Edward Hall, born in 1881, was a respected Episcopal priest serving at St. John the Evangelist Church in New Brunswick. He was well educated, well-spoken, and deeply embedded in a social circle dominated by wealth and influence. Eleanor Mills, born in 1888, was a married woman, a mother of 2 children, and a devoted choir singer at the same church. To the outside world, their connection appeared purely religious. In reality, their relationship had crossed into a secret romantic affair that violated social norms, religious expectations, and marital vows. The condition of the bodies immediately revealed the violence of what had taken place. Edward Hall had been shot once in the head with a .32 caliber pistol. The bullet entered just above his right ear and exited through the back of his neck, a trajectory suggesting precision rather than panic. Eleanor Mills had been shot 3 times, once beneath her right eye, once above her right temple, and once above her right ear. These were not random shots. They were intentional, excessive, and deeply personal. As investigators examined Eleanor more closely, they discovered something even more disturbing. Her throat had been violently slashed, and maggots were already present in the wound. This detail alone indicated that she had been dead for at least 24 hours before the bodies were discovered. The way the bodies were arranged raised more questions than answers. Both victims lay parallel to one another, their feet pointing toward the crab apple tree. Edward's had been placed over his face, concealing the gunshot wound. His calling card was deliberately set near his feet. Between the 2 bodies, investigators found torn fragments of love letters, private correspondence ripped apart and scattered, as if to ensure their affair would be exposed even in death. Eleanor's left hand had been positioned to touch Edward's thigh, while Edward's right arm was arranged to reach toward Eleanor's neck. The message was unmistakable. Whoever committed this crime wanted the world to know exactly why these 2 people had died. Almost immediately, the investigation began to unravel due to chaos and negligence. The crime scene was located near the boundary between Somerset County and Middlesex County, creating confusion over jurisdiction. Police from New Brunswick arrived first, but the land technically belonged to Franklin Township. While authorities debated responsibility, word spread quickly. Curious locals flooded the area. People walked through the field, trampled footprints, handled evidence, and even took items as souvenirs. Edward Hall's calling card was passed from hand to hand among the crowd. By the time the scene was secured, critical physical evidence had been permanently destroyed. As detectives turned their attention to the victims' personal lives, the motive began to emerge. Edward Hall had been married since July 20th, 1911, to Frances Noel Stevens Hall, a woman born on January 13th, 1874, into one of New Brunswick's most powerful and wealthy families. Frances was not just a minister's wife. She was connected by blood and marriage to elite families whose money and influence shaped local politics, business, and social life. For someone of her standing, public humiliation was not merely embarrassing, it was devastating. Eleanor Mills' life stood in sharp contrast. She lived modestly at 49 Carmen Street in New Brunswick with her husband, James E. Mills, who worked as a church sexton and a school janitor. Together, they raised 2 children, Charlotte and Daniel. Eleanor's affair with Edward Hall placed her in an impossible position, emotionally entangled with a powerful man while remaining trapped in a life with few protections and even fewer allies. Suspicion quickly focused on Frances Hall and her family. Investigators theorized that Frances had discovered the affair and viewed it as an unforgivable betrayal. According to the prosecution's later narrative, she did not act alone. Her brothers were drawn into the suspicion. Henry Howgill Stevens, born on November 10th, 1869, was a retired exhibition marksman, a man whose skill with firearms was well known. William Willie Carpenter Stevens, born March 13th, 1872, owned a .32 caliber pistol similar to the murder weapon. Their cousin, Henry de la Bruyere Carpenter, a Wall Street stockbroker born in 1882, was also named as a suspect. Despite these suspicions, the original investigation in 1922 failed to produce indictments. Evidence was compromised, witnesses were inconsistent, and the accused belonged to families with immense social power. The case might have faded into obscurity if not for relentless media coverage. Sensational newspapers, particularly the New York Daily Mirror, published constant speculation, anonymous tips, and dramatic accusations. Public pressure mounted until Governor Harry Moore ordered a second investigation, culminating in a trial that began on November 3, 1926. The Hall Mills trial became a national spectacle. For nearly 30 days, the Somerset County Courthouse in Somerville was packed with reporters, spectators, and social elites. The courtroom was not just a place of justice. It was a theater where class, privilege, and morality collided. The prosecution argued that Frances Hall had orchestrated the murders, driven by jealousy and rage, and that her brothers had carried out the killings. The defense countered with aggressive tactics, portraying the accusations as gossip fueled by prejudice against wealthy families. The most dramatic testimony came from Jane Gibson, a local pig farmer whose property was near the crime scene. On the night of the murders, she claimed her dog began barking violently around 9 p.m. She said she went outside, mounted her mule, and rode toward the cornfield. There, near the crabapple tree, she saw 4 figures standing together. She heard gunshots and saw one person fall. She testified that a woman screamed, "Don't," 3 times. As she turned away in fear, more shots rang out, and she saw a second body collapse. Most chilling of all, Jane claimed she heard a woman shout the name Henry. The defense attacked Jane Gibson relentlessly, portraying her as unstable, unreliable, and easily confused. Her story changed slightly over time, and when she testified from a hospital bed rolled into the courtroom, the jury struggled to determine whether she was a truthful witness or a woman overwhelmed by fear and imagination. Without solid physical evidence, and with witnesses under constant attack, the prosecution's case began to weaken. In the end, the verdict shocked many but surprised few. Frances Hall, Henry Howgill Stevens, and William Carpenter Stevens were all acquitted. Henry de la Bruyere Carpenter was never tried. Justice, at least in the legal sense, was never served. The emotional impact was devastating. Eleanor Mills was buried in Van Leeuw Cemetery alongside her husband and children, her reputation forever stained by a secret relationship revealed in death. Edward Hall was buried in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. Frances Hall lived out her life under a cloud of suspicion and died in December 1942, eventually buried beside the man she was accused of killing. One by one, all the suspects died, taking whatever secrets they held with them to the grave. Today, the Hall Mills murder remains one of America's most haunting unsolved cases. Countless books, films, and theories have attempted to explain what happened in that field in September 1922. Some blame jealousy. Others blame family power and influence. But the truth remains elusive. What is certain is that 2 lives were ended not only by bullets and blades, but by secrecy, status, and silence. And that is what makes this case unforgettable. Not because we know who it did, but because we never truly will. Case 4 Wilhelm Justus Goebel entered the world on January 4th, 1856, in Pennsylvania, born to Wilhelm and Augusta Goebel, immigrants who had journeyed from Hanover, Germany, in search of new opportunities and a better life in America. As the eldest of 4 children, his arrival was fraught with peril. He was 2 months premature and weighed less than 3 pounds, a fragile infant whose survival seemed uncertain. Yet from this vulnerable beginning emerged a man whose life would be marked by intellect, determination, and unrelenting ambition. His father, a private in Company B of the 82nd Pennsylvania Infantry Regiment during the tumult of the American Civil War, fought battles far from home, leaving Augusta to shoulder the enormous responsibility of raising their children largely on her own. She instilled in them a deep appreciation for their German heritage, teaching language, customs, and values, while Wilhelm, like his siblings, navigated the delicate balance between honoring his roots and adapting to the culture of the country that had become their new home. Until the age of 6, Wilhelm spoke German exclusively, a reflection of his upbringing and familial ties. Yet as he grew and absorbed the environment around him, he gradually embraced American culture, adopting the English spelling of his name as William, a symbolic step toward forging an identity that would merge the traditions of his ancestry with the possibilities and expectations of his adopted homeland. In 1863, following his father's discharge from military service, the Goebel family relocated to Covington, Kentucky, a town that would serve as the backdrop for Wilhelm's formative years, his education, and the early development of the qualities that would shape his extraordinary career. It was in Covington that young Wilhelm attended school, his intellect and curiosity evident from an early age, and it was there that he embarked upon an apprenticeship with a jeweler in nearby Cincinnati, Ohio, learning the meticulous attention to detail, precision, and patience that would later serve him well in law and politics. The mid-1870s saw him briefly enrolled at Hollingsworth Business College, where he acquired practical skills and business acumen, but the law called to him with irresistible force, and he soon apprenticed under the tutelage of John W. Stevenson, a former governor of Kentucky whose mentorship would guide Wilhelm from a student of law to a trusted partner and, ultimately, the executor of Stevenson's estate, a role that signified the level of respect and confidence he had earned in professional circles. In 1877, Wilhelm graduated from Cincinnati Law School, a formal acknowledgement of his legal proficiency, and he further refined his education by enrolling at Kenyon College in Gambier, Ohio, before joining the practice of Kentucky State Representative John G. Carlisle, where he honed his understanding of legislative processes, governance, and political strategy. By 1883, with the passing of Stevenson's previous partner, Wilhelm rejoined the firm in Covington, stepping fully into a sphere of influence that would define his career and public life, blending his prodigious intellect, disciplined work ethic, and innate political acumen to craft a path that would eventually carry him to the highest echelons of Kentucky's legal and political world. Wilhelm Justice Goebel, by the time he was ready to step into the political arena, was already a man defined by contrasts. Brilliant yet socially austere, formidable yet distant, commanding yet enigmatic. According to historian James C. Clotter, Goebel was not the type of person who drew crowds with charm or charisma. He belonged to few social organizations, and beyond his closest circle of friends, he greeted hardly anyone with a smile or a handshake. In matters of the heart, he remained remarkably aloof, rarely linked romantically to any woman, and history would remember him as the only governor of Kentucky who never married, a solitary figure whose dedication to politics and intellect appeared to eclipse personal attachments. Contemporary observers could not ignore his unusual physical presence. The journalist Irvin S. Cobb famously described Goebel as physically reptilian, a description evoking both an unsettling calm and a cold, calculating intensity. Others noted his contemptuous lips, a sharply defined nose, and humorless eyes that seemed to weigh every interaction with clinical scrutiny. Goebel was no master of rhetoric. He shunned the florid oratory common among politicians of his era, preferring instead a deep, resonant voice, a steady cadence, and the occasional piercing phrase that could stir emotions or underscore a political point. While his speeches were never flamboyant, their force and clarity carried weight, and his true power lay not in style, but in intellect. He was voraciously well-read, a man whose comprehension of law, policy, and political strategy left both allies and rivals in awe. Cobb himself admitted to never having been more impressed with any man's intellect than he was with Goebel's, a testament to the sharp mind that would carry him through a life filled with political battles, controversies, and ultimate tragedy. By 1887, the stage was set for Goebel to step into formal politics. James William Bryan had vacated his seat in the Kentucky Senate to pursue the lieutenant governorship, leaving an opportunity in Covington that Goebel was determined to seize. He campaigned vigorously, positioning himself as a champion of railroad regulation and the rights of labor, advocating fiercely that the people, not corporations, should control chartered entities, a stance that aligned with the principles of his mentor, John W. Stevenson. At the same time, the Union Labor Party was rising in influence locally, appealing to both Democrats and Republicans with a platform similar to Goebbels, ensuring that the contest will be far from a guaranteed victory. Despite the precariousness of the race, Goebbels' strategic positioning and reputation for political savvy carried him forward, and after a tense, razor-thin count, he won the seat by a mere 56 votes, a victory that reflected both the volatility of local politics and the tenacity with which he pursued his ambitions. On December 30th, he was sworn in, entering the Senate not just as a new legislator, but as a force prepared to challenge entrenched power. Este wasted no time asserting his influence. Early in his first term, the State Railroad Commission undertook an unprecedented assessment, increasing the tax evaluation on the vast properties of the Louisville and Nashville Railroad to over $3 million. When pro-railroad legislators in the Kentucky House of Representatives proposed legislation to abolish the commission, Goebbels spearheaded resistance, joining a committee led by Cassius Marcellus Clay to investigate the extensive lobbying and violations perpetrated by the railroad industry. The findings were damning, revealing systemic corruption and abuse of political influence, and Goebbels leveraged this evidence to defeat the bill in the Senate, solidifying his reputation as a champion of accountability and a foe to corporate overreach. His unyielding approach, coupled with a capacity to negotiate and, when necessary, break deals if a better strategy emerged, earned him the moniker William the Conqueror among both supporters and political observers. His ability to navigate the intricate web of Kentucky politics, balancing alliances and rivalries with precision, demonstrated that his intellect was matched only by his ambition, and that he was a man willing to bend the machinery of government toward his vision of public service, no matter how controversial or risky the path. In the spring of 1895, the streets of Covington, Kentucky, would become the stage for a confrontation that would cement William Goebbels' reputation as a man unafraid to face danger head-on, a man whose intellect and political cunning were matched by a fierce streak of personal resolve. The incident involved John Lawrence Sanford, a former Confederate General Staff officer turned local cashier, a man who harbored lingering grudges against Goebbels. Their animosity had grown over years, fueled in part by Goebbels' successful campaign to remove tolls from certain turnpikes across Kentucky, a reform that had cost Sanford a significant sum of money. Observers speculated that Sanford's attempts to block Goebbels' appointment to the Kentucky Court of Appeals were motivated by vengeance, a personal vendetta intertwined with the larger currents of political power. Goebbels, never one to remain silent when insulted or slighted, had escalated the tension with an article in a local newspaper in which he mockingly referred to Sanford as Gonorrhea John, a sharp, public insult that ensured neither man could back down without loss of face. On April 11th, 1895, the collision of these two forces seemed almost inevitable. Goebbels, accompanied by two acquaintances, walked the streets of Covington to cash a check, and, aware of the potential for confrontation, suggested they avoid Sanford's bank entirely. Fate, however, had other plans. Sanford, positioned outside the bank, intercepted the trio before they could cross the street to another establishment. He greeted Goebbels' friends with his left hand in a show of civility, but Goebbels' sharp eyes caught the dangerous truth. Sanford's right hand rested on a concealed pistol tucked inside his coat. Trained by experience and intuition, Goebbels instinctively clutched his own revolver in his pocket, the weight of the weapon a tangible reminder of the peril that hung in the air. As the two men faced each other, Sanford's voice cut through the tension, his words precise and accusatory. "I understand that you assume authorship of that article." Goebbels, unflinching and composed, met the challenge directly, replying simply, "I do," his calm acknowledgement inflaming the volatile situation. What followed was a blur of instinct and split-second decisions, an encounter so fast that witnesses struggled to reconstruct the sequence of events. At precisely 1:30 p.m., both men drew their pistols, The rapid exchange of gunfire, so instantaneous that no observer could determine who had fired first. W.J. Hendricks, then Attorney General of Kentucky, admitted, "I don't know who shot first. The shots were so close together, capturing the chaotic intensity of the moment." Another witness, Frank P. Helm, recalled being pressed up against the two men and initially believing he had been struck himself. So close and violent was the volley of gunfire. The outcome was both miraculous and tragic. Sanford's bullet tore through Goebel's coat and shredded his trousers, yet left him unharmed, while Goebel's shot struck Sanford squarely in the head, fatally wounding him. Sanford would die 5 hours later, leaving the community reeling from the unexpected and deadly clash. Goebel, ever mindful of the law and its consequences, pleaded self-defense, a position that would ultimately shield him from conviction. The acquittal was particularly significant because Kentucky's Constitution explicitly prohibited dueling, meaning that a conviction would have rendered Goebel ineligible to hold any public office, effectively ending his political career before it had reached its peak. Despite the legal vindication, the shooting did not end public scrutiny or criticism. Many Confederate veterans in Kentucky, already wary of Goebel due to his non-Southern roots and the service of his father in the Union Army, viewed the incident as a mark of unworthy violence, a stain on his reputation among influential factions of the electorate. Yet, even amid the controversy, the duel demonstrated something that few could deny: Goebel's courage under pressure, his ability to confront threats directly, and his unshakable resolve to defend both his honor and his principles. Characteristics that would continue to define him as he maneuvered through the treacherous waters of Kentucky politics in the years to come. By the mid-1890s, Kentucky politics was a volatile mixture of populist reforms, entrenched party loyalties, and simmering resentment from decades of post-Civil War divisions. William Goebel, already a figure of immense influence in the Kentucky Senate, was acutely aware of the power that elections and the machinery of government wielded. The 1895 gubernatorial election had left a bitter taste in the mouths of many Democrats, particularly after Republican William O. Bradley had narrowly claimed victory. Goebel and his allies believed that the county election commissioners, who were responsible for overseeing local elections, had acted unfairly, tilting the scales in favor of Bradley. To Goebel, this was not merely a matter of partisan grievance. It was a direct threat to the integrity of the political system he had spent decades mastering, and it was an affront to the democratic principle that the people should control their government, not powerful, unaccountable interests. In response, Goebel drafted and championed a bill that would forever mark his name in Kentucky's political history, the so-called Goebel Election Law. Passed along strict party lines and over Governor Bradley's vehement veto, the law created a 3-member state election commission with sweeping authority. This commission, appointed entirely by the Democratic-controlled General Assembly, was empowered to select the county election commissioners, effectively placing the electoral machinery firmly in the hands of Goebel and his allies. By design, the law allowed only Democrats to sit on the state commission, cementing the party's control over the electoral process. Critics decried the law as a brazen, self-serving maneuver, a blatant grab for political power under the guise of reform. The law became a lightning rod for controversy, inciting opposition from constituencies across both parties and fostering a climate of suspicion and distrust that would shadow Goebel for the rest of his career. The ramifications of the Goebel election law reached their apex during the gubernatorial election of 1899, a contest that would become one of the most infamous in Kentucky history. The political climate was already tense. Just 3 years earlier, William Jennings Bryan had electrified the Democratic National Convention with his Cross of Gold speech, securing the party's nomination for president. Many Kentucky delegates, however, balked at Bryan's free silver platform, viewing it as a populist deviation from Democratic orthodoxy. When Republican William McKinley won the 1896 presidential election, carrying Kentucky with him, the stage was set for an epic showdown in the state's gubernatorial race, a race that would test the limits of political strategy, loyalty, and legality. 3 men sought the Democratic nomination: Goebel himself, Parker Watkins Hardin, and William Johnson Stone. Initially, Hardin appeared to have the edge, a front-runner in the chaotic landscape of the party convention in Louisville. Sensing an opportunity, Goebel and Stone struck a calculated alliance. They devised a strategy to control the convention from within. Stone supporters would vote according to Goebel's direction for the chairman of the convention, and in return, Goebel would drop out of the race but maintain influence over the remainder of the party ticket. They also agreed that if either were eliminated or withdrew, their delegates would support the remaining ally rather than Hardin. As the convention convened on June 24, 1899, the plan unfolded with precise but chaotic effect. Ballot after ballot failed to yield a clear majority, and Goebel's carefully chosen chairman executed a critical move. The candidate with the lowest vote total in the next round would be eliminated, which turned out to be Stone. Stone's supporters were forced into a dilemma: side with Hardin, seen as a railroad-friendly puppet, or align with Goebel, whose reputation as a fierce reformer and political tactician was growing. A majority chose Goebel, granting him the nomination, but the maneuver left lingering resentment and deep divisions within the Democratic Party. Not all were satisfied. A faction calling themselves the Honest Election Democrats rejected Goebel's nomination entirely, holding a separate convention in Lexington and selecting John Y. Brown as an alternative candidate, further splintering the electorate and setting the stage for an exceptionally tense general election. When the general election arrived, the results were razor-thin. Republican William S. Taylor narrowly defeated both Democratic candidates, his lead over Goebel totaling a mere 2,383 votes. Accusations of voting irregularities quickly followed, particularly in counties where local Democratic officials were alleged to have manipulated procedures. The Board of Elections, established under the controversial Goebel election law and staffed with 3 pro-Goebel Democrats, ruled 2-1 that disputed ballots should be counted, citing the law's limits on their authority, but deferring ultimate judgment to the General Assembly. The Assembly, wielding its constitutional power, invalidated enough Republican ballots to overturn the initial results, effectively declaring Goebel the victor. The decision ignited fury among Republicans and voters in traditionally Republican districts, with some fearing that Kentucky was on the brink of civil unrest. For several tense days, the state teetered on the edge of chaos, a powder keg of partisan conflict, legal ambiguity, and deep-seated resentment that would ultimately erupt into violence and tragedy. Despite the narrow victory and the chaos surrounding the 1899 election, Wilhelm Goebel knew that the battle for the governor's office was far from over. Rumors of a deadly plot circulated through Frankfurt, whispers of guns and hired hands lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Even with these threats, Goebel showed no sign of hesitation. On the morning of January 30th, 1900, flanked by 2 loyal bodyguards, he strode through the cold winter streets of Frankfurt toward the old state capital, determined to assert his authority. The tension in the air was almost palpable, a mixture of political fervor, personal loyalty, and the simmering hatred of those who refused to accept his legitimacy. Eyewitness accounts vary, and historians still debate the precise sequence of events. But what is known is terrifyingly clear. Somewhere nearby, in the state building overlooking the Capitol, 5 or 6 shots rang out. One bullet struck Goebel in the chest, tearing through the fabric of his coat and lodging dangerously close to his heart. The governor crumpled to the ground, conscious but gravely wounded, while panic rippled through the Capitol and the city beyond. The specter of civil war seemed imminent. Republican William S. Taylor, still claiming authority as governor pending the final resolution of the election, immediately called out the state militia. He also ordered the General Assembly into a special session in London, Kentucky, a Republican stronghold, hoping to consolidate his claim. But the Democratic legislators resisted, many refusing to leave Louisville, insisting that Goebel, despite his wounds, remained the legitimate governor. Both factions claimed authority, yet the Republicans were too few to achieve a quorum, leaving the state in a tense, constitutional limbo. In a remarkable and almost surreal twist, Goebel, though mortally wounded, was sworn in as governor that very evening. In what would be his only official act, he signed a proclamation to dissolve the militia summoned by Taylor, a gesture ignored by the militia's Republican commander, further highlighting the precariousness of his position. Surrounded by 18 physicians and an anxious retinue, Goebel's condition deteriorated steadily. Despite their best efforts, he succumbed to his injuries on the afternoon of February 3, 1900, 4 days after the shooting. Journalists who witnessed his final moments recorded his last words with reverence. "Tell my friends to be brave, fearless, and loyal to the common people." Some accounts, tinged with dry humor even in the face of death, recount him remarking after his final meal, "Doc, that was a damned bad oyster." Goebel became, and remains, the only American governor ever assassinated while in office. The assassination sparked immediate legal and political turmoil. Goebel's body was transported with care, an appointed political statement. Disdaining the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, which he had long opposed, his remains were not carried along their direct lines. Instead, the body traveled circuitously from Covington north across the Ohio River to Cincinnati, before heading south to Frankfort on the Queen and Crescent Railroad, a symbolic defiance even in death. Meanwhile, the Kentucky Court of Appeals ruled that the General Assembly had acted within its authority in declaring Goebel the winner of the disputed election. The decision was appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court in the case of Taylor versus Beckham. But on May 21, 1900, the justices refused to hear it, leaving the Assembly's ruling intact. Goebel's lieutenant governor, J.C.W. Beckham, ascended to the governorship, stepping into an office still shadowed by violence and controversy. The ensuing investigation read like a political thriller. Suspicion immediately fell upon deposed Governor Taylor, who had fled to Indianapolis, fearful of indictment. Yet the governor of Indiana refused extradition, meaning Taylor could never be formally questioned about his potential involvement. Over the next decade, 16 individuals were indicted in connection with Goebel's assassination. 3 testified in exchange for immunity, while 5 went to trial. Convictions were eventually secured against Taylor's Secretary of State, Caleb Powers, along with Henry Yahtzee and Jim Howard. Powers was accused of masterminding the plot to maintain Taylor in office. Yahtzee served as an intermediary, and Howard was alleged to have fired the fatal shot. Appeals, retrials, and pardons would dominate the next several years, with Powers and Howard ultimately pardoned in 1908, while Yahtzee, sentenced to life, turned state's evidence and was eventually pardoned in 1919. Historians today still debate the true identity of Goebel's assassin, the details shrouded in contradictions, confessions, and political maneuvering. Despite the violence and legal chaos, Goebel's legacy endured. Streets and parks in Kentucky, including Goebel Avenue in Elkton and Goebel Park in Covington, stand as lasting tributes to a man whose life and death were inseparable from the fierce and often brutal currents of politics in the late 19th century. His story of power, ambition, and ultimate sacrifice continues to resonate, a chilling reminder of how fragile democracy can be when passion, vengeance, and political intrigue collide. Case 5. Imagine a cold March evening in 1900 in the quiet town of Konitz, West Prussia. The streets are empty, the air crisp with the lingering chill of winter, and the townspeople are going about their routine, unaware that a tragedy is about to unfold that will shock the entire region and ignite a firestorm of fear, suspicion, and prejudice. On March 11th, Ernst Winter, a 19-year-old student attending the gymnasium of Konitz, vanished after leaving his boarding house following dinner. Known locally for his reckless behavior and flirtatious ways, Winter was the son of a respected architect from Prochnow. His life, though seemingly ordinary, carried whispers of indulgence, and he had been seen in the company of several young women in town. The disappearance of this young man, once thought merely a case of a boy gone missing, would quickly evolve into one of the most infamous murder cases in Wilhelmine, Germany, inflaming long-standing anti-Semitic tensions and leaving a trail of injustice in its wake. At first, Winter's disappearance seemed plausibly accidental. The townspeople feared he might have fallen through the ice while skating on a nearby lake, a reasonable assumption given the harsh Prussian winter and the dangerous frozen waters. The community mobilized quickly, searching the lake and its surroundings in a frantic effort to locate the missing student. Then, on March 15th, horrifying evidence emerged. Parts of Winter's body were discovered under circumstances so gruesome they immediately escalated the case into a full-blown criminal investigation. His right arm was found tossed over the fence of a nearby Protestant cemetery, an act that shocked and horrified locals, hinting at deliberate desecration. The dismemberment of his body suggested someone with anatomical knowledge was involved, instantly turning the eyes of investigators toward local butchers. Among the primary suspects was the Christian butcher Hoffman, whose daughter had been frequently seen with Winter and whose household had allegedly expressed hostility toward him. Winter's head was later recovered from a pool on April 15th, frozen and preserved in the ice for some time. While forensic examination of his stomach contents revealed he could not have died later than 7 o'clock the evening he disappeared, providing a critical timeline that would contradict early assumptions and direct suspicion toward calculated foul play rather than an accident. As investigators probed deeper, an insidious wave of anti-Semitism swept over Konitz and surrounding areas. Right from the start, right-wing publications such as Berlin's Staatsbürger Zeitung, led by editor Wilhelm Brun, sought to blame the Jewish population for Winter's murder. Brun moved permanently to Konitz to oversee reporting and pressure locals to testify against Jewish residents, spreading rumors and inciting panic. Yet the police found no evidence linking Jews to the crime, though the narrative of ritual murder, a dangerous superstition claiming that Jews harmed Christian children during Passover rituals, quickly gained traction. In the face of mounting public hysteria, police and detectives, influenced by the prevailing anti-Semitic atmosphere, pursued improbable testimonies implicating Jews, while Christian witnesses withheld crucial evidence. Confounding the investigation further, the owner of the handkerchief used to wrap Winter's head was revealed only by accident to be the wife of the local school superintendent, Rodi. Additionally, 2 young men last seen with Winter never came forward, while his clothing, critical evidence, had been left in his city residence until January 1901, only to be found later in a public park over several days, creating a complex web of confusion and suspicion. Christian butcher Hoffman, initially arrested under suspicion, was later released to a warm reception from the city council, highlighting the societal divisions surrounding the investigation. The court reasoned that Winter's murder must have involved multiple perpetrators with a premeditated plan, which paradoxically fueled anti-Semitic conspiracies alleging ritual murder. County physician Dr. Muller incorrectly concluded that Winter had bled to death, and the premature publication of his opinion by his son caused a judicial censure, showing the tensions between authorities, the press, and the public. By June 8, 1900, acts of violence against the Jewish community had escalated dramatically. A shed near Konitz synagogue was set on fire, and within days, the synagogue itself, along with Jewish homes, suffered attacks severe enough to require military intervention. Similar, though less severe, riots erupted in Chersk on April 22nd, Stalp and Budo on May 21st to 22nd, Tuchel on June 10th, and Kamarkzin on June 17th. While rioters faced light sentences, Jews were punished harshly for minor infractions, such as defending themselves from harassment, illustrating systemic bias and institutionalized anti-Semitism. The investigation and trials were riddled with injustice. Wolf Israelski, a Jewish man seen near the site where Winter's head was found carrying a sack, was detained for nearly 5 months before being proven innocent at trial on September 8, 1900. Adolf Louis and his son Moritz, local butchers, were accused despite having irrefutable alibis. Moritz's alleged association with Winter was tenuous at best, yet he was implicated by witnesses of questionable credibility, including Maslow, whose testimony was riddled with inconsistencies, such as impossible observations and improbable timelines. Masloff's mother-in-law, Ross, attempted to fabricate evidence to claim a reward, alleging she saw Winter's belongings in the Louis household, even though critical items, like a photograph, never existed. Both Masloff and Ross were eventually convicted of perjury, receiving sentences of 1 year and 18 months, despite petitions for leniency. Moritz Louis himself was later sentenced to 4 years for perjury in 1903, but was pardoned by the emperor in October, after which the Louis family relocated to Berlin. The Jewish population of Konitz declined sharply, from 481 residents in 1900 to 350 by 1903, a stark reflection of social ostracization and economic ruin caused by false accusations. Investigations conducted by the Königliches Medizinal Collegium in Danzig, and later confirmed by the Wissenschaftliche Deputation für Medizinalwesen, conclusively established that Winter had been choked to death, disproving early claims of bleeding and ritualistic motives. The motive for his murder, as revealed by these investigations, was likely jealousy and personal animosity, rather than the ritualistic explanations spread by anti-Semitic agitators. Meanwhile, those who had incited hatred and spread false narratives were finally brought to justice. Brun and Bodicher of the Staatsbürger Zeitung were jailed for libel on October 11, 1902, yet both would eventually be elected to the Reichstag. The case highlighted not only the fragility of justice, but also the devastating power of mass hysteria, media manipulation, and entrenched prejudice. Even years later, violence inspired by the case continued, as in 1903, when Abraham Levy, a Polish typesetter, was beaten to death by drunken assailants who taunted him over Winter's murder, illustrating that the societal scars left by this tragic case persisted long after the original crime. Ultimately, the murder of Ernst Winter, shrouded in false accusations, societal fear, and anti-Semitic hysteria, stands as a harrowing example of how prejudice can distort investigations, ruin lives, and fracture communities. Meticulous investigations eventually revealed the truth, exposing jealousy as the underlying motive and clearing innocent individuals from wrongful imprisonment. Yet the legacy of the Konitz case remains a cautionary tale about the destructive consequences of rumor, bias, and mass panic, highlighting the urgent need for fairness, critical thinking, and the protection of innocent lives in the face of fear and misinformation. Case 6, what if a quiet night on a small farm in South Australia ended in horror? The year was 1902, and in the sleepy town of Tawita, just 6 kilometers west of Sedan, tragedy struck a large Wendyish family in a way that would shock the nation and remain a mystery for decades. On January 1st, 13-year-old Johann Elizabeth Skippen, known to her family and friends as Bertha, was brutally murdered in her own home. She was the youngest child of Mathis and Johann Skippen, a hard-working farming couple who that day had traveled to Eden Valley to visit relatives. The family had been split across their properties. 3 older siblings were working on other farms, and the 2 younger brothers had chosen to sleep in a nearby barn. This left Bertha and her 24-year-old sister Mary completely alone in the house, setting the stage for a night of terror that would leave the community in shock. The night began as any other, but at approximately 10 p.m., Mary claimed to have awoken to find a strange figure lying across her chest. According to her testimony, the man was bearded and posed an immediate threat, pinning her to the bed. Mary struggled to free herself, a terrifying ordeal that would define the night, before managing to escape the house. In a state of panic, she ran to alert her 2 younger brothers, who immediately came to investigate and raise the alarm. By the time authorities arrived, the unthinkable had happened. Bertha was found lifeless, the victim of an incredibly violent attack. She had been stabbed and slashed around 40 times, her body bearing the marks of a brutal and frenzied assault that made it clear this was no ordinary crime. The scene was horrifying, an image of unimaginable violence in the quiet, pastoral setting of Tawita, and the event immediately became the subject of local fear, gossip, and suspicion. From the outset, suspicion fell heavily on Mary Skippen herself. The local coroner, Dr. Ramsey Smith, led the inquest into Bertha's death, and it was Mary who was charged with the murder of her younger sister. Newspapers across South Australia reported extensively on the case, each headline fanning public interest and speculation. With little concrete evidence pointing to anyone else, Mary was committed to stand trial in Adelaide. The gravity of the accusation against a young woman from a respected farming family gripped the public imagination, as neighbors and townsfolk struggled to reconcile the violent crime with the quiet life of the Skippon household. Every detail of the case, from the isolation of the home to the timing of the parents' absence, was scrutinized for clues to Mary's possible involvement. The trial began in March of 1902 before Chief Justice Sir Samuel Way. Mary was represented by the distinguished lawyer Sir Josiah Simon K.C., who fought tirelessly to demonstrate the circumstantial nature of the evidence against her. Throughout the proceedings, the prosecution laid out a narrative that relied heavily on suspicion and opportunity. Mary had been present in the house at the time of the attack. She had survived the night unharmed while Bertha did not, and the opportunity existed for her to commit the crime. Witnesses were called, and the inquest records were presented, yet no definitive proof could link Mary to the murder. The courtroom buzzed with tension, and the press covered every twist and turn with fervent interest, turning the trial into a spectacle that captivated readers and fueled countless theories about what truly happened that night. As the trial unfolded, alternative suspects came under consideration. Public attention began to shift toward Mary's father, Mathis Skippon, a man with a known history of violence. Some theorized that he may have had a motive to silence Bertha, if she possessed knowledge that could embarrass or incriminate him. Others pointed to Mary's boyfriend, 21-year-old Gustav Nitschke, who similarly could have had a reason to prevent Bertha from revealing sensitive information. However, Nitschke had a solid alibi, being in Adelaide at the time of the murder, and the logistics of Mathis traveling to the farm and back under the cover of darkness were deemed highly unlikely. Despite these alternative theories, the lack of hard evidence left the case unresolved, and speculation continued to grow both in the courtroom and among the general public. Finally, the jury returned a verdict. Mary Skippon was acquitted. The court recognized that the prosecution's case rested entirely on circumstantial evidence, and no conclusive proof tied Mary to the brutal killing. The acquittal did little to quell public curiosity or media speculation. Questions lingered about who could have committed such a horrific act and why, and the shadow of suspicion continued to fall across the Skippon family. Mary's ordeal had taken a profound emotional toll. She had survived a night of terror and endured public scrutiny, legal jeopardy, and the death of her sister, all while the identity of the true perpetrator remained a mystery. The family, once close-knit and industrious, was now haunted by fear, grief, and a lingering cloud of suspicion from neighbors and townsfolk. Over the years, the story of Bertha's murder continued to capture the imagination of the public and the media. In 1984, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation released a telemovie titled The Skippon Mystery, dramatizing the events of that fateful night and the subsequent trial. Books, documentaries, and scholarly analyses have explored the case, often highlighting the enduring mysteries and unresolved questions. Despite exhaustive investigation, speculation, and public scrutiny, the murder of Johann Elizabeth Bertha Skippon remains officially unsolved. The reasons behind the brutal attack, the identity of the killer, and the true motives remain hidden, leaving a chilling legacy in Twitter and beyond. The murder of Bertha Skippon is more than just a tale of crime. It is a story of fear, suspicion, and the fragility of human trust. A young girl lost to unspeakable violence, a sister accused but never proven guilty, and a family forever marked by grief. All elements that combine to form a haunting, unresolved chapter in Australian history. It reminds us that sometimes, even with the most thorough investigations, some crimes defy resolution, leaving communities, families, and generations to grapple with the unanswered question: who truly killed Bertha Skippon, and why? Case 7 imagined the remote, rugged bush of early 20th century Australia, where isolation and the harsh elements shaped the lives of those who dared to call it home. In this unforgiving landscape, around 1916, James Jim Barkley carved out a life for himself as the manager of Wanangata Station. A man in his late 40s, Barkley had already endured profound personal loss. His wife had succumbed to tuberculosis, leaving him a newborn child, also named James, who was entrusted to the care of relatives far from the wild expanses of Wanangata. Despite the solitude, historians like Harry Stevenson paint a picture of Barkley as a hardy, competent bushman, a man of simple tastes, quietly content with the rhythms of life in the Australian outback. He had a solid relationship with his nearest neighbor, Harry Smith, the stepson of Wanangata's original owner. A rare human connection in a place defined by isolation and self-reliance. That be why December 1917, Barkley made the practical decision to hire a cook and station hand to help manage the daily demands of the station. His choice fell on John Bamford, an English-born man who had lived for 2 decades at Black Snake Creek, 12 miles from the nearby settlement of Talbotville. Bamford, in his late 50s, was a man whose reputation preceded him. Descriptions of him ranged from surly to possessing a wicked temper, and whispers circulated that he had once strangled his wife, a claim that later authors Keith Layden and Michael Ray assert lacks any supporting evidence. Whether Barkley shared these concerns is unknown, but Talbotville's storekeeper Albert Stout had warned him to avoid conflict, cautioning him not to be drawn into arguments with Bamford. Yet, wartime realities likely left Barkley with few options. With World War I drawing men away to the front and a scarcity of reliable laborers in the bush, hiring Bamford may have seemed a necessary risk. Alan King, a stockman who stayed at Wanangata later that December, would recall that Bamford appeared to get along with Barkley, suggesting at least a functional working relationship between the two men. The final days of December 1917 would mark the last known sightings of Barkley and Bamford alive. Both men had traveled to Talbotville to participate in the reinforcement referendum, the second of 2 plebiscites held during the war to gauge public support for conscription, a deeply divisive issue that would send Australian men to the front lines. Though records do not reveal how Barkley and Bamford voted, it is known that they agreed on their choice, standing together on a matter that reflected both civic duty and the pressures of a nation at war. That night, they stayed with Albert Stout in Talbotville, their last known point of safety and human companionship. On the morning of December 21st, around 10 o'clock, the 2 men departed Stout's house and set off for the isolated expanse of Wanangata Station, unaware that this journey would mark the beginning of a chilling mystery that would endure for decades. The chilling discovery of Barkley's fate began on January 22, 1918, when Harry Smith, the stepson of Wanangata's original owner and the closest neighbor to the station, arrived to deliver mail. As he approached the homestead, the sense of unease began immediately. There was no sign of Barkley or Bamford, 2 men who only weeks earlier had been seen laughing and chatting with neighbors as they cast their votes in Talbotville. On the kitchen door, a curious message had been chalked in large, casual letters, "Home tonight." It was meant to be reassuring, but now it struck Smith as ominous, an almost mocking relic of life that no longer existed. He lingered for 2 nights, hoping against hope that the men would return, but the station remained deserted, silent except for the occasional whisper of wind across the dry plains. With no answers, Smith left for Eaglevale on January 24th, 1918, leaving behind only questions. Weeks passed before Smith returned, but the visit on February 14th, 1918 confirmed his worst fears. Approaching the homestead in the late afternoon, he was struck by the eerie stillness that hung over the place. The mail remained where he had left it on his previous visit, untouched and gathering dust. More alarming, Barkley's loyal dog, once a sprightly companion, was found starving, neglected, its eyes dull and wary. Smith scoured the property briefly, searching for any sign of the missing men, but the station offered only silence in return. That night he stayed at the deserted homestead, the wind and the sounds of distant wildlife filling the empty rooms. At first light, he left for Dargo to raise the alarm, sending urgent word to the owners, Arthur Phillips and Jeffrey Ritchie of Mansfield, that something was terribly wrong. The next breakthrough came on February 23, 1918. Arthur Phillips, accompanied by stockmen Jack Jebb and Harry Smith, returned to Wanangata from Eaglevale and began a painstaking search of the surrounding area. Their efforts were soon rewarded with a grim discovery near the Conglomerate Creek, approximately 420 paces southeast of the homestead. There, partially unearthed and in a state of decomposition, lay the body of James Barkley. What little clothing remained, along with a belt and a tobacco pouch, allowed Smith to identify the body with sorrowful certainty. Though the press later incorrectly reported that the skull had been detached, the truth was even more disturbing. Barkley's skull was still attached, but protruding from the sand, a silent testament to the violence of nature that had disturbed the shallow grave where he had been buried. The body was reburied carefully, and Phillips immediately returned to Mansfield to contact the authorities. Police responded promptly. Detective Alex McCarroll, dispatched from Melbourne, arrived alongside Constable Ryan, a local familiar with the rugged Mansfield district. Several days later, they embarked on the grueling 80-mile ride across the Great Dividing Range, navigating treacherous terrain to collect Barkley's remains and transport them back for a postmortem at Mansfield Hospital. The homestead itself revealed sinister hints of the crime. That first night, while preparing a meal, the police discovered strychnine hidden in the pepper container, an unsettling clue that suggested premeditation and the cold, calculated nature of whoever had orchestrated the disappearance. Further investigation at the station uncovered more strange details. In Barkley's room, a recently discharged shotgun rested, though no bloodstains were visible. His bed lay in disarray, as if a struggle had occurred or someone had rifled through the room. Bamford's quarters told a similar story: disorder and absence. The station horse, saddle, and several of Bamford's belongings were missing, raising the chilling possibility that the pair had left under duress or been forcibly removed. On their return through the Howitt High Plains, the police party encountered another haunting sign. The horse that Bamford had ridden to Talbotville for the referendum vote was found running wild, without a saddle or bridle, a symbol of the chaos and mystery that now engulfed Wanangata Station. Each clue, the scattered rooms, the poisoned pepper, the runaway horse, painted a picture of calculated disappearance and potential foul play, yet the true horrors of what had occurred in the remote Australian bush remained shrouded in uncertainty. The grim reality of what had happened to James Barkley was confirmed after the postmortem, which revealed the shocking details of his death. It was determined that Barkley had been murdered by a shotgun blast to the back, a violent act that had left him lifeless for several weeks before his body was discovered. Detective Alex McCarroll, who had led the investigation, offered his unsettling theory at the inquest. He believed that Barkley and Bamford had likely argued over work-related matters, and that Bamford, in a fit of rage or calculation, had loaded the shotgun and shot Barkley at close range. McCarroll suggested that Bamford had then attempted to cover his tracks, removing his own working clothes, dressing in Barkley's missing suit, saddling his horse, and dragging Barkley's lifeless body to the creek before riding off into the wilderness. The inquest could only deliver a verdict of murder by person or persons unknown, assigning the tragic window of death between December 21st, 1917 and January 4th, 1918. Barkley's body was eventually returned to his extended family on the Mornington Peninsula, and he was laid to rest at Tyabb Cemetery, a somber farewell for a man whose life had ended so violently and mysteriously. The attention quickly turned to John Bamford, now the prime suspect in Barkley's murder. The authorities launched a statewide search, placing a 200-pound reward on information leading to the killer, a significant sum at the time, reflecting both the seriousness of the crime and the urgency to solve it. During the hunt, a man claiming to be Bamford appeared near Yarram, asserting that he had murdered Barkley. But the claim was quickly disproven. The man, suffering from delusions, was identified as a vagrant named James Baker, and he offered no answers about the real crime. Months passed, and the mystery deepened. It was not until early November 1918 that Mounted Constable Hayes, accompanied by Bushman Harry Smith, William Hearn, and Jim Fry, stumbled upon a grim discovery on the Mount Howitt Plains. While scanning the rugged landscape near the Howitt Plains hut, her noticed a boot protruding from a pile of logs. Investigating further, the men unearthed John Bamford's body, long missing and now lying hidden under the weight of timber, snow, and time. With the route back to Mansfield still blocked by snow, they transported the remains 80 miles to Dargo, where post-mortem confirmed that Bamford had died from a bullet lodged in his skull. The inquest echoed the earlier one for Barkley, delivering the verdict: murder by person or persons unknown. Bamford was buried at Dargo Cemetery, a tragic end that offered no closure to the mystery that had haunted Wanangata Station. The discovery of Bamford's body shifted the theories swirling around the case. Until that point, it had been widely assumed that Bamford had killed Barkley, and the logic seemed straightforward. But with Bamford dead, speculation emerged that he may have been shot in revenge by a friend of Barkley, in a scenario reminiscent of the wild justice of frontier days. Police suspicion briefly focused on Harry Smith, Barkley's closest neighbor and a man intimately familiar with the property. Yet there was no direct evidence linking Smith to either murder. Smith had been present when Bamford's body was discovered, making it highly unlikely that he had orchestrated a cover-up. Moreover, it seemed implausible that he would have left his friend Barkley's body for weeks to be disturbed by animals without taking action. Smith was never charged, though historians like Harry Stevenson later speculated that he might have had an answer to the mystery, noting that older cattlemen in the region remained reluctant to discuss the events even decades later. Alternative theories abounded. Some suggested that the two men might have fallen victim to stock thieves, a theory supported by local anecdotes but contradicted by police reports. The only livestock missing from Wanangata was Bamford's horse, which had already been recovered from Mount Howitt, leaving little evidence of theft as a motive. Other bizarre details, such as the placement of Barkley's right shoe and hat near his body, led to sensationalized interpretations, including the notion that he had been murdered by a jealous husband for being a ladies' man. But these theories were later dismissed as the product of novelists and storytellers who had little understanding of the actual investigation. Life eventually moved on for those connected to the tragedy, but the scars remained. Barkley's son, Jim Jr., after finishing his schooling, went on to work at Eagle Vale with Harry Smith for many years, a quiet echo of the connection his father had had with the station. Smith passed away in 1945, age around 86, taking any lingering secrets with him. Decades later, in the late 1970s, historian Wallace Mortimer interviewed Jim Jr. about the events at Wanangata Station. The son's enigmatic response captured the enduring mystery and frustration surrounding the case. It was all a long time ago, and both the murderers are long since dead. I can't see that anything can be gained now. It's all best forgotten. The words hung in the air, a reminder that some crimes, no matter how meticulously investigated, leave questions that time itself cannot answer. Case 8, it was a quiet afternoon in February 1921 in the small Tasmanian village of North Monton, a place of winding roads, dense bushland, and the kind of stillness that hides secrets. On February 20th, 13-year-old Chrissy Claire Venn, a lively and innocent girl, left her home on Allison Road, a short 3-mile distance from the village center, to run errands for her family. Her parents, George Arthur and Eva Mae Venn, were unaware that this simple walk would mark the beginning of a tragedy that would haunt their lives forever. Chrissy never returned. As evening descended, a sense of unease gripped the community. Searches were quickly organized by neighbors and family, scouring the nearby roads and wooded areas where she might have wandered. Days passed, but Chrissy was nowhere to be found. It wasn't until the morning of March 1st, 1921, nearly 10 days later, that her body was discovered, hidden in a hollow tree stump along the road she would have walked to reach North Monton. The scene was chilling. The child had been mutilated, and the brutality of her murder shocked the small community to its core. People whispered about the horror, unable to comprehend how such a thing could happen in their quiet village. Investigation quickly turned to those closest to the events of that day. Among them was George William King, a 35-year-old former miner and ex-policeman who had participated in the initial search for Chrissy. King became a prime suspect due to marks on his hands, which he claimed had been sustained while helping with the search, but which investigators interpreted as possibly connected to the crime. His arrest on March 8, 1921 sent shockwaves through the town. A man known and trusted in the community was now facing the most serious of charges. King's trial began months later in Hobart, after a historic change of venue, the first ever requested and approved in Tasmania, to ensure a fair hearing away from the small, emotionally charged community. Represented by Albert Ogilvie, a future premier of Tasmania, King faced the daunting challenge of defending himself against a charge that stirred public outrage. The trial, commencing in June 1921, scrutinized every detail. His movements that day, the marks on his hands, the timeline of Chrissy's disappearance, and the mounting circumstantial evidence. Despite the intensity of the prosecution, on August 11, 1921, George William King was acquitted. There was no concrete evidence tying him to the murder, leaving the case shrouded in uncertainty. For Chrissy's family, the emotional toll was unimaginable. George and Eva Venn were left to grapple with the sudden, violent loss of their daughter, a child taken in an act of inexplicable cruelty. Their grief was compounded by the public scrutiny and speculation surrounding the trial, the whispers in the community, and the unresolved nature of the crime. Chrissy was laid to rest at the North Mawton Methodist Cemetery, a solemn place where her memory was preserved, though justice remained elusive. In the years that followed, the story of Chrissy Venn became part of local lore. Residents and visitors alike reported hauntings near the site of her murder, a chilling reminder of a life cut short and a crime never solved. Her case remains one of Tasmania's most mysterious and enduring unsolved murders, a tragedy that continues to evoke sorrow, fear, and speculation even a century later. The disappearance, the horror of her murder, the scrutiny of a trial, and the lack of closure for the Venn family paint a picture not just of a crime, but of a community forever changed. It's a story of innocence lost, trust betrayed, and questions that may never be answered. One that continues to haunt the quiet roads and shadowed trees of North Mawton to this day. Case 9, it was a quiet Brisbane evening on September 19, 1952, a night that began like any other, but would soon be etched into history as the beginning of one of Queensland's most haunting unsolved mysteries. Betty Shanks, a bright, ambitious young woman of 23, had spent the day attending her night lecture at the State Commercial High School. A University of Queensland graduate and dedicated public servant for the Commonwealth Department of Interior, Betty was the pride of her family, deeply loved by her parents, and well regarded in her community. That evening, she was making her way home in the familiar neighborhood of Grange, a short, routine walk she had taken countless times before. After her lecture ended around 9 p.m., her lecturer kindly gave her a lift to the Windsor tram stop, where she boarded a tram towards Grange. Witnesses saw her disembark at Days Road terminus shortly after 9:30 p.m. From there, she began the final leg of her walk, a mere 400 meters along Thomas Street toward her home on Montpelier Street. It was a distance she had traveled countless times, yet that night, it would become the path to a horrifying fate. Betty's father, waiting up for her return, grew anxious as the minutes passed. When she failed to appear, her parents reported her missing to the local police at 1:30 a.m., beginning a tense and frantic search that would culminate in tragedy. At 5:35 a.m. the following morning, a nearby resident, who also happened to be a policeman, discovered Betty's brutally beaten body in the garden of a house on the corner of Carberry and Thomas Streets. The scene was shocking. A young woman, full of promise and life, violently taken in what was soon to become Queensland's largest criminal investigation at the time. Police quickly began reconstructing her final minutes. Through witness accounts and the stopped hands of Betty's wristwatch, they estimated the murder had occurred in a narrow 12-minute window between 9:38 p.m. and 9:53 p.m. Witnesses reported hearing screams between 9:38 p.m. and 9:45 p.m., a chilling reminder of the terror she must have endured. The investigation considered various possibilities. One theory suggested she may have been attacked by a known sex offender. while another proposed a chilling case of mistaken identity, with the murderer perhaps intending to target a doctor's receptionist who regularly walked the same route carrying keys to a surgery containing drugs. Despite extensive police work and numerous individuals coming forward with confessions, none were ever substantiated. The investigation faced frustrating dead ends, and the case quickly became infamous for the mystery surrounding the identity of her killer. Over the decades, the tragedy of Betty Shanks became a symbol of both the fragility of life and the frustration of a community left without answers. Her murder left a lasting scar on her family. Betty's parents, devastated by the violent loss of their daughter, endured the pain of unanswered questions for years, mourning not just the death itself, but the inability to see justice served. The neighborhood of Grange, too, was shaken, with residents haunted by the realization that such a violent act could occur in broad daylight, along a familiar street in a familiar town. Even today, as of 2024, Betty Shanks' case remains unsolved, and a reward of 50,000 Australian dollars is still offered for information leading to the capture and conviction of her killer. Her story endures as one of Queensland's oldest and most notorious cold cases, a haunting reminder that some crimes leave questions that may never be answered yet demand that we remember the victims and continue seeking justice. Case 10. It was a calm, early morning in Rockhampton, Queensland, on March 9, 1967, when Mima McKimhill, a 31-year-old home management advisor, began her routine journey. Mima was a dedicated professional, employed by the Capricornia Regional Electricity Board, and known for her warmth, intelligence, and meticulous nature. Her role required her to travel across central Queensland, visiting households to promote electrical services and demonstrate new appliances. That day, Mima left Rockhampton at 8 a.m., driving south toward Calliope, just as she had done countless times before. She had no reason to suspect that this ordinary workday would end in tragedy, or that she would never return home. By the following morning, her car had been found abandoned on the Gladstone Bypass Road, 3 kilometers north of Benarby. The scene raised immediate alarm. The vehicle was left in a manner suggesting that something was terribly wrong. The community and authorities were deeply concerned, and the search for Mima began in earnest. Days stretched into weeks, and the tension in central Queensland grew as hope waned. Then, on March 26, 1967, the unthinkable happened. Her body was discovered at Collard Creek, alongside the Dawson Highway, nearly 80 kilometers from where her car had been abandoned. The discovery was devastating, shocking both her family and the wider community, and cementing Mima's murder as one of Queensland's most haunting cold cases. Mima's family was inconsolable. The public service worker, known for her independence and professionalism, had been violently taken from them, and the mystery surrounding her death made their grief unbearable. Her funeral was held at St. Paul's Cathedral in Rockhampton on April 4, 1967, where friends, colleagues, and relatives gathered to mourn her untimely death. Later that day, her remains were cremated at the Rockhampton Crematorium, offering a formal farewell, yet leaving behind unanswered questions that would haunt those who loved her. Police quickly launched an extensive investigation, following multiple lines of inquiry. One lead involved 4 men seen traveling locally in a Ford Custom Line, who were never located despite efforts to track them down. Decades later, in 2011, authorities confirmed that these men were still persons of interest. Another line of inquiry focused on a truck driver transporting tallow, whose movements around the time of Mima's disappearance raised suspicion. Despite the efforts of the initial investigation, no arrests were made, and the case grew cold over the following decades. Public attention reignited decades later, beginning in 2007, when Mima's close friend and former colleague, Shirley Eldridge, contacted Rockhampton's The Morning Bulletin to mark the 40th anniversary of Mima's murder. Eldridge's campaign for justice captured widespread attention, prompting the Queensland Police Service to reopen the cold case in March 2008. Renewed efforts brought the case back into public consciousness, with authorities affirming in 2010 that the investigation was ongoing and that all leads were being pursued thoroughly. In 2014, the Queensland government approved a $250,000 reward for information leading to the apprehension and conviction of Mima's killer. Shirley Eldridge further chronicled the case in her 2016 book, Mima, A Case of Abduction, Rape, and Murder, in which she identified a German truck driver as the primary suspect. Eldridge claimed that in 2009, police were preparing to travel to South Australia to arrest the man, but he had died 6 weeks prior in Tailem Bend, preventing any action. While authorities have not officially verified these claims, they have repeatedly been cited in media coverage, keeping the case in the public eye. Even years later, new witnesses came forward. In 2018 and 2019, a former long-distance truck driver reached out to the police with information about the abandoned vehicle, prompted by a television appearance by Eldridge in 2016. Despite delays in investigators following up on his tip, the case remained active, with the Queensland Police Homicide Cold Case Unit committing to constant review of evidence and leads. Today, Mima McKimhill's murder remains a tragic, unsolved cold case, a haunting reminder of a life taken too soon. Her story continues to resonate not only for the brutality of the crime, but for the tireless efforts of friends, family, and investigators determined to seek justice. Authorities continue to pursue every lead, hoping one day to bring answers to Mima's grieving family and to hold the person responsible accountable for a crime that has left a permanent mark on Queensland's history. Case 11, the city of Rockhampton, Queensland, was abruptly shaken in late February 1947 by news that would haunt the community for decades. A young woman had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and by the following morning, the horror of her fate was revealed. The victim, Flora Pryor, age 25, had been brutally murdered, her body found on the banks of the Fitzroy River near the Commercial Hotel, less than 150 meters from the center of the city. The shocking proximity of the crime to the urban heart of Rockhampton and the violent nature of the attack sent waves of fear and grief through the population, leaving neighbors and friends questioning how such an atrocity could occur in their peaceful community. Flora Pryor had been staying in Rockhampton temporarily, having traveled from her job as a domestic servant at Alpha Cattle Station. Originally from Cooktown, she was known for her gentle demeanor, quiet resilience, and hardworking nature. Flora was respected and cared for by those who knew her, and she had come to Rockhampton for a short break before returning to her duties. Friends and family remember her as diligent, cheerful, and full of potential, traits that made the violent disruption of her life all the more devastating. Her sudden disappearance immediately sparked fear and speculation as the community searched for answers. On the evening of February 25, 1947, Flora left her temporary residence at the People's Palace on Denison Street for an unknown errand. That night, she never returned. Her absence alarmed those who knew her routines, and by early morning on February 26th, a man walking along Quay Street made a discovery that would horrify Rockhampton forever. Flora's lifeless body was lying on the riverbank, showing clear signs of suffocation, likely caused by someone pressing a hand over her mouth and nose. The brutality of the assault immediately suggested this was not a simple crime of opportunity, but a planned and violent attack. The initial police investigation quickly focused on the nature of the attack. It became evident that the assault was sexual in nature, and the struggle Flora endured had left her body with injuries consistent with extreme violence. Investigators noted that the attack likely occurred shortly before midnight on the 25th of February, a narrow window that allowed them to reconstruct her last movements. Police were faced with the grim task of identifying suspects in a case where the victim's final moments had been marked by terror, helplessness, and betrayal by the attackers. The community response was immediate. Flora's funeral, held on February 28, 1947, drew mourners from across the city. 50 people gathered outside the funeral parlor to witness the hearse and mourning coach proceed across the Fitzroy Bridge to the North Rockhampton Cemetery, where Flora was laid to rest. The turnout reflected the community's grief and anger. Her family, devastated by the loss, struggled to reconcile the violence inflicted upon their loved one. while neighbors expressed outrage that such brutality could occur in the heart of their city. Police rapidly identified 3 men as suspects in the crime: Ernest Joseph Davidson, 18, a lad porter; Roy Joseph Howard, 21, a station hand; and Mark Matheson Dean, 20, a laborer. These men were believed to have encountered Flora on the streets of Rockhampton on the night of the 25th and coerced her to the riverbank, where the horrific events unfolded. The focus of the investigation was on their actions during this narrow window of time and the evidence that could link them to Flora's death. Their prior movements and relationships with local establishments were scrutinized in detail. Court proceedings began at the Petty Sessions Court on March 6, 1947, drawing more than 100 people peering through doors and windows, desperate to witness the legal response to the shocking murder. Police statements and witness testimonies began to build a chilling narrative of the events leading to Flora's death. Investigators revealed that Davidson had admitted approaching Flora and leading her to the riverbank, where Dean and Howard joined in. This confession, alongside other testimonies, suggested premeditated action and coordinated violence. Evidence presented in court indicated that all 3 men participated in the sexual assault. Davidson admitted in a statement that he had relations with Flora and that Dean and Howard subsequently joined the act. During the assault, a handkerchief was reportedly used to cover her mouth, while the men applied violence that resulted in her suffocation. Dean's confession indicated that attempts were made to revive Flora, but they were unsuccessful, leaving her body abandoned on the riverbank. Witnesses further confirmed seeing the men with Flora prior to her death, solidifying the prosecution's narrative of the crime. The trial, which commenced in the Rockhampton Supreme Court on May 12, 1947, drew attention not only for the violence and sexual nature of the crime, but also for courtroom behavior. Judge Frank Brennan, confronted with an unusually large public gallery, grew frustrated at spectators' morbid curiosity and banned public attendance for the remainder of the trial. His anger underscored the intense societal interest and horror at the case, reflecting the widespread concern that such depravity could capture public imagination to the detriment of justice. Judge Brennan's remarks highlighted the societal shock at the case. He told spectators to busy yourselves with some useful and necessary employment or occupation rather than remain in court and steep your minds in low, sexual depravity, expressing outrage at public fascination with the sordid details. His decision to limit courtroom access underscored both the brutality of the crime and the need for controlled, sober legal proceedings, illustrating how the community's morbid curiosity had to be balanced against the solemnity of justice. The jury was instructed that the charges of willful murder required evidence beyond reasonable doubt. Following deliberation, the 3 men were found guilty of manslaughter rather than murder, as the jury determined that there was insufficient evidence for a willful murder conviction. This decision reflected legal limitations, despite the heinousness of the crime. It left the public and Flora's family outraged, as the initial sentence did not reflect the full brutality of the actions taken against her. Judge Brennan sentenced all 3 men to 7 years imprisonment, a decision that provoked immediate criticism. The leniency, given the violent sexual assault and suffocation, led to widespread outrage in the press and community. Editorials in newspapers like the Courier-Mail condemned the sentence, stating that it failed to provide justice for the victim and her family. The case became a focal point for debate about sentencing guidelines and judicial discretion in violent crimes, particularly those involving sexual assault. In response to public anger and advocacy from community members, the Attorney General David Gledson appealed the sentences. The appeal was successful, and the Court of Criminal Appeal unanimously increased the punishment for all 3 men to 15 years imprisonment, a more severe reflection of their culpability. Chief Justice Neil Macrosin emphasized the gravity of the offense, noting that the law required harsher punishment to uphold justice and send a societal message that such violence could not be tolerated. The aftermath of the case left a lasting impression on Rockhampton. Flora's murder highlighted the vulnerability of women in public spaces and the need for more robust legal protection. Her family endured unimaginable grief, compounded by the initial legal decisions that seemed inadequate. Over time, the appeal and increased sentences provided some measure of justice, but the emotional scars remained. The case would be remembered as a watershed moment in Queensland criminal history, particularly in relation to sexual violence and public outrage over judicial leniency. Beyond legal consequences, Flora Pryor's case became emblematic of the societal struggle to comprehend the depths of human cruelty. The community grappled with how ordinary individuals could commit such a coordinated and violent act. Judge Brennan's handling of the public gallery, the initial lenient sentencing, and subsequent appeal all contributed to a broader public discourse about morality, justice, and the role of courts in addressing heinous crimes. The case was cited in subsequent legal and historical analyses as an example of public impact on criminal justice outcomes. Decades later, the memory of Flora Pryor endures in Rockhampton's collective consciousness. Her story is recounted not only for its tragic end, but also as a cautionary tale about vulnerability, justice, and community responsibility. The murder remains a historical marker, a reminder of the need for vigilance and compassion in society, and the importance of pursuing justice even when the path is fraught with legal and emotional challenges. Flora's life, though cruelly cut short, continues to inspire reflection on both human brutality and the resilience of those left to remember and honor her.